Morning, everyone. We might make a start. It's a few minutes after 11, so we might kick this session off. All right, so Josh, if you can just share the presentation and we'll get underway. Thanks, Josh. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for webinar 7 in our series, which is covering Introduction to Bridge Assessments. In today's session, as you'll see, the focus of this session is applying conditions for heavy vehicle access. All right, so move on to the next slide. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, or for those who've been on the whole journey, here's where we're up to, number 7. We've only got a couple left to go in this series. If you are joining us for the first time, you'll probably see that we'll refer to some concepts that perhaps we've covered in the previous webinars. So good idea to go back and watch these in order, because we build the content as we go through this particular series. But today we'll be covering off on applying conditions for heavy vehicle access. So very quickly, presenters for today, myself, Todd Willard, the project manager for the Strategic Local Government Asset Assessment Project here at the NHVR. And joining me today will be Josh White, who's Senior Access Facilitator here at the NHVR. So Josh is going to be doing the bulk of today's session around applying conditions, including a bit of a demo with a dummy application in the NHVR portal. So that's covering off both of us. I'll quickly finish my little bit and then I'll hand over to Josh. So my welcome, as I said, the focus today will be around asset conditions and applying those, and then we'll do a bit of a Q&A. So if I can ask you if you wouldn't mind, so that we can save the questions to the end, as we go, just drop the questions into the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the session, time permitting. Okay, so format, as I said, just drop those questions into the chat and we'll discuss those at the end. If you haven't already, I think there might be someone who's left their microphone on. So if you wouldn't mind, please muting your microphone so that we avoid any unnecessary feedback and conversation in the background. Always a trap with doing these sessions. We've all found ourselves in that situation at one time or another. So we are recording these sessions as with the others. And that will be emailed out with the slides. And as I said earlier, please watch them in the order that we've done these series so that you fully understand the different content as we've built through it. And look, just a final, I suppose, a bit of a plug for the Strategic Local Government Asset Assessment Project. We're doing a lot of work around building some tools and resources here, and you can find all that information in our project website, which you see on the left-hand side of the right-hand side of the screen. If you haven't already registered at the nhvr.engagementhub.com.au, please do so, because you'll find all these resources and other information about the project within that particular workspace. As I said, don't worry about writing that down. If you're madly trying to do that, we will be sending this information out. We can drop that in the chat as well, that little link, so that you've got it there to jump in and register. All right, well, that just about covers off my piece. Some of the learning outcomes for today, we just want to touch on, and I think this is really important. I'm sure all of you have been in some training sessions previously regarding the portal, but I think it's important just to recap on that application process. And then in particular, looking at how we can use different asset conditions to manage risk. So standard bridge conditions, how you do custom conditions, and also custom condition sets. Really, really important so that you get the right conditions on those consents that you're putting through for access. So that's our learning outcomes. And we'll jump over the next slide, and at this point, I'll jump out. I'll hand over to Josh. Josh, welcome. And I'll leave it to you to cover off that material and maybe a bit more background on yourself for everybody who's viewing.
Thanks, Todd, for the introduction. My name's Josh White. I'm a Senior Access Facilitator. I'll just share my screen again. Get back to the actual thing. I'll minimize this. So like I said, my name's Josh White. I'm from the Access team. I'm a Senior Access Facilitator. Some of you may have spoken to me. I predominantly have dealt with Class 1 applications in the past, but I've recently moved over to Class 2 and 3. So hopefully I get to know more of you. I'm very friendly and very approachable, so more than happy for you. If you ever have any questions about applying conditions, more than happy for you to give me a call to ask the question. So don't think that this presentation is it. I'm always open for those questions. So first of all, we're just going to run through some general slides to run through what conditions are and how we can apply them. I'm going to just run through these pretty quickly. Like Todd said, these particular slides will be available after the webinar. So it'll give you time to read over it. But really, I think the best thing for us is to run through the example application and see how to apply it. I'm sure you'll have a few questions about that. So conditions. The HVNL introduces the concepts of vehicle, road and travel conditions. The road transport legislations that preceded the HVNL do not distinguish between different types of conditions, as one agency was responsible under the legislation for access to decisions. Under the HVNL, vehicle conditions are primarily the responsibility of the NHVR, while road and travel conditions are primarily the responsibility of the road manager. So we'll run through in today's presentation the difference between road and travel conditions and when to apply them and when not to apply them. Also, we'll run through vehicle conditions. These conditions are predominantly set by the regulator, the NHVR, and they're standard conditions that we will apply to an application, and I'll show you where we apply those in the presentation, in the example presentation. But basically just gives you an overview of what conditions are. So these are some standard conditions. So some of you may have seen these standard conditions. And these codes are basically pretty standard codes that we utilize. So I think it's good to know. So if we run through some of the examples that are on the screen, you'll see the first one, top left-hand side, RT01. So we use the code RT to indicate restricted time. So whenever you're looking for a condition that is in relation to time, I would use the RT to search it, but we can run through that again further in the example. If you go to the right-hand side, you can see PE01, PE meaning pilot and escorts. So these are if you're required to apply pilot and escort conditions. Over to the left. Over to the left again, the right, sorry, I'm getting my right and left mixed up. LE14, so this would be in relation to under the law. So basically referring back to the HVNL and the vehicle requirements of that particular vehicle. So that basically references the different schedules in the law. So basically what they need to abide by with their vehicle. So going down below underneath the RT01, you can see RT04. So again, that's a series of restricted time conditions. So quite often when you're searching for conditions in the condition set, you may see that RT01 isn't the most appropriate condition, but we do have other conditions that are more appropriate that you can utilize. And some of these conditions are standard conditions and some of them are variable conditions. Standard conditions are pretty much what the text says is what the condition is, and variables allow us to input different variables. So for example, a good example of that is the pilot and escort conditions. So that we don't set a standard pilot and escort condition, we do give our road managers the capacity to change that particular pilot and escort requirement, because we know depending on the width and the length of the vehicle, different pilots and escorts would be required in that particular movement. So we'll just move on to the next slide. the NHVR and road or travel conditions. So as mentioned in the previous slide, road and travel conditions are primarily used by the road managers themselves. However, the NHVR may utilise the power to impose road or travel conditions under particular circumstances. So that's generally due to public safety or due to infrastructure. So we might impose additional travel conditions. For example, one of our standard conditions that we put on every single permit that we issue is GO03, which is to do with third-party requirements. Because we don't know every single third-party requirement that a particular customer needs to get, i.e. a third party could be to do with electricity, it could be to do with police requirements, it could be to do with private road requirements. Because we don't know that, we do put that as a code that they do have a duty of care to make sure that they have all their third-party requirements in place when travelling. So the road manager and vehicle conditions. So obviously, there are some instances where you will want to impose vehicle conditions. Like I said at the beginning, generally this is imposed by the regulator themselves, and it's directly linked to the HVNL. So be assured that if you're just a little bit concerned, that we do have those codes in place. So if it is a Class 1 vehicle, we will reference the law and their vehicle requirements under the HVNL. But yes, there are instances where you as a road manager would apply vehicle conditions, and like it says on the right hand side of the slide, it's to do with potential damage to road infrastructure, adverse effects on the community, and significant risks to public safety. But we can run through that later on in our example. Conditions about consultation with third parties. So previously I did mention about the third party condition, the standard condition that we do impose. So rest assured that we do impose a standard condition. I do know with all the conditions that I have seen, and I do encourage it, where road managers will specify the actual third party required, and they'll give contact details, which is great. So, a lot of ones that I see are going on to different, for example, if you as a road manager own the road, however, the structure or the culvert or potentially the sewer lines or there's different roads that are owned by third-party entities. I do know that I've seen that one as a common one, so that's definitely something that we do encouraged to put on the permit. It allows the customer to have that contact and know that this asset itself is not owned by us. We give approval to go up to that point. However, once you go over that point, you do need to get that third-party approval. Standard OSIM and SPV conditions. So there's some pretty standard OSIM and SPV conditions that get imposed on the permit to begin with. So there is 4 in particular that are to begin with. I'll go over these now, but then you'll be able to see them in the presentation. So we'll have our third party condition, which references always having to make sure that you've got your third parties in place. You've got your, it's a code called LEOL. Basically what it references is that some vehicles may have conditional registrations. They may have other kind of conditions that they have to abide by that are outside of the regulator. That's a code that basically says you need to make sure that those are abided by before you abide by this particular permit. You've got LE14, which references the law and the vehicle conditions that need to be imposed. I.e., in the example, you can see the oversized signage on this particular vehicle. All of those particular requirements are covered in the HVNL and are covered under the code LE14. And the last one we do reference, which is a standard OSIM and SPV conditions, is standard pilot and escort conditions. So what this does is this code references the notice associated with that vehicle. So, for example, there's quite a few quite a few gazettes out there for different SPVs and different OSM vehicles. If a road manager doesn't impose pilot and escort conditions as a part of our requirement for public safety, we will always put a standing condition that refers them to the minimum pilot requirement. So if that is unfortunately missed for some circumstance, please know that that is covered under the overall permit anyway, so that, you know, if they did require 1 or 2 pilots, that would be addressed in the relevant gazette. So this is just a flow chart that runs through the permit workflow. I'll leave this slide for you to kind of go through, because I'm kind of going to go through that through the example anyways. But yeah, basically it just shows from start to end and the different processes that we go through. So if you do have any questions about that, please let me know. Or if you have any questions later on, please don't hesitate to give me a call. I can answer those questions in relation to how the permit workflow goes. So when you do receive an application, so once the NHVR has sent it to you to give consent, you do have 3 options. So option 1 is granting it without conditions. Basically, that means that there's no risk to be mitigated, and therefore you can just grant it with the conditions. You are happy with the standard codes that have been provided by the regulator, and you're happy for that approval for that particular vehicle to travel on your infrastructure. Option 2 is granted with conditions. Granted with conditions is basically there is a risk involved. However, if you impose these particular conditions, that risk it's a lot less that risk would occur. And those can be added. You can add those conditions by using the standard conditions that we provide, custom condition, and I'll run through those particular different methods of giving conditions. Last particular decision that you can make is a refusal. So basically, you reviewed the infrastructure, you've looked at the conditions and gone, there's no condition I could impose that would reduce the risk or eliminate the risk. And in doing so, because I can't add conditions, we need to refuse it because it's basically going to cause either damage to infrastructure, it's going to have an adverse effect on the public. And that's the thing. When giving a refusal, unfortunately, just giving a refusal saying I don't want them to go on the road is not a correct refusal. It always needs to be linked back to the HVNL and reasoning behind that. And I believe back in the last slides, the 3 things that you can give a refusal on is potential damage to road infrastructure, the adverse effect on the community arising from noise, emissions, or traffic congestion, significant risk to public safety arising from the use of restricted access vehicle in a manner incompatible with road infrastructure or traffic conditions. So those are the 3 main reasons as to why, and they're directly linked to the HVNL. And that's why sometimes if you give a refusal and we send it back to you, it's just because we need that particular reasoning in detail, because obviously we issue a refusal document to the customer and we need to give a reason that complies with the HVNL as to why they've been refused. Using conditions to manage risk. So I've kind of run through this, and I'll run through this in the presentation, how to use conditions to manage risk. So I'm just going to jump into the portal demonstration. Please know that this example is done through just training services. This is not a real life example, so I've tried to draft it up as best as possible, and I'll be using TMR as an example. However, this is none of the stuff that is the example goes over it's not reflected on actual real life culverts or bridges or situations. It's just a dummy example. So what happens is, first and foremost, we at the regulator would assess this application. I'll give you a pretty brief review of how we would assess this. So we basically review the information that the customer has given us. We ensure that details like their total mass equal their axle group masses, or if it's not, the total mass has to be less than that axle group mass to give them a bit of tolerance, as the indivisible item may move during the movement. We review it with general tables to make sure that those mass limits are not completely out there. So for example, with this particular example, it's a 10-axle platform, and we would review it and make sure that it wasn't out of the ordinary. So this is pretty standard. Generally speaking, a customer's looking for about 15 tons per line, and we would just have a general review to make sure that looked pretty correct. Obviously, sometimes you'll see stuff that slips through that doesn't look right. And that's just if we've missed it. Unfortunately, we've missed it, but generally speaking, we'll give a general review of that. Once we've reviewed that, we would then go into what's called a permit library. Hopefully it loads up, and we would add our standard conditions. So these are added up front even before you guys receive it. So like I said, we have some standard conditions that are always added, and you're able to view these standard conditions as well. So I'll show you where in your view where you're able to see it. So if you do want to add a condition and you're not sure if it's already been added, you'll be able to see it. So there's no need to add the same condition twice if the regulator's already added it. So for example, there's your third-party condition. Then there's your condition LEMS1, which is your pilot and escort requirements, which are already standard conditions up front. There's your LE14, which refers them to the MDL and Schedule 8 in the MDL, which is the section of Class 1 vehicles, which what they need to abide by. And there's the standard other laws and legislation. So obviously, outside of the NHVR, there are other legislations and laws that they need to abide by, not just the conditions imposed by this particular application or this particular permit. So basically, those conditions will be updated up front. I'll just make this a little bit. Yeah. We'll also do a general review of the actual route, just to have a look at it, particularly if it's running under a notice or a gazette. We won't send you anything that's under a gazette. We'll only send you roads which are not on a gazette or are not covered under a pre-approval. If they're not covered under the gazette or pre-approval, you will receive a notification to assess that particular section of road. So in this one, we're going to be starting at McDonald's, and we're going to be ending up at a state forest. So it's just a random example. So Chinchilla, I've never been to Chinchilla McDonald's. I hope it's good, but that's where the truck driver is going to start his journey. What ends up happening is I would end up, once I've done my quick assessment, I would generate consent, and that would send it through to you as the road manager. So I'll just have a look at your view. So obviously, when you get that review, you'll get a notification to say start assessment. You just click the blue button that says start assessment, and then once you've clicked that blue button, it will take you to this screen, which gives you the same options that we mentioned beforehand, which is approval with conditions, and refusal. So like I said, if you were to just give it an approval, you would just go down after you've approved it and you would submit your request. Obviously, you would do a review of the particular route, and if you had no problems, you would submit your request. and then that would go through. Approvals automatically accept it on our end, and therefore we don't have to accept it. Whereas with approval with conditions, we need to review the conditions that you impose. So there is the instance where you go, yes, I do want to approve it. However, I only want to give them a year. That's because potentially you're monitoring the road infrastructure and you want to make sure that in a year's time, you want to review it again. So just a little FYI, when we do process our applications, we always go out for 3 years, and that's to give the customer, I guess, the best possible outcome. Give them a permit that will last the longest that we can issue a permit under the law. So that's 3 years. However, if you are monitoring that particular infrastructure and don't have any conditions to impose, you would just click approval with conditions. And then, as you can see, that would give you the capacity to change the dates. So then you would run through here and go, I only want to give 1 year. And it's always, yeah, so you would then impose that condition and then go down to the bottom and submit your request. Let's also say that you get this application. It's starting from the 27th to the 26th. If you don't change this date, what happens is the approval is backdated and it wipes off a portion of the customer's access. So, for example, let's say the approval wasn't given until the 10th of August. If you don't change this date, it wipes off 2 weeks of their permit. So if you want to update it on the same day that you process it, so if you process it on the 10th, you can then update it to the 10th and adjust those dates there so that they get their permit from the day that you've given their approval. So once you've selected approval with conditions, and you look at the route. So in this particular example, if we have a look at the route, this particular vehicle is going over this bridge, and they're also going over a number of bridges and culverts, but there was just 2 that I kind of picked up. I think there's a culvert over here. There's a little culvert here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go, there's 2 bridge and culvert conditions, and I want to give conditions for them to go over that. So I'm happy for them to go over it, but to reduce the risk, they need to do the following. So what we do is we go into the add condition section and we go into add conditions. Now, the best way to find if it's, so these conditions are going to be your standard conditions. So these are conditions that the regulator's already created for you to utilize. The reason why we've created these conditions is for consistency. So because we issue permits for a different range of states, we want to make sure that they have pretty standard conditions so that if a customer is traveling from South Australia to Queensland, those conditions are pretty much the same wording. They don't have, they're not the same thing, but different wording. They're exactly the same. So we encourage you to use the standard conditions, but then I'll go through what happens if you can't find a standard condition and it is a valid condition. But if we go through the conditions, what I do is I generally look in the search where I'll go bridge. So I want to apply a bridge condition. And I'll run through those ones to see if there's any good examples. So this one here, I don't know why it didn't want to be that. Standard bridge condition is BR01. So that's probably the best one for you to look at. So that's probably why I couldn't find it using bridge. So if something doesn't turn up, if you're looking at bridge or culvert, maybe use different words like structure, and that's how you'll search it. So if I was to look up structure, I would have found this particular condition. So what we do is once we've found our bridge condition, we would then add it. And then we would basically go over here and we would go, it is the Warrego Highway. So that's the road over structure. So we would go John River, and then we would go the location. So we would basically indicate the location of that structure, and it also gives you the capacity to actually put a structure number in. So let's say structure number is 123, and it is 12 kilometers along the Warrego Highway. Then what happens is you're able to delete this section here and basically impose additional conditions. So standard conditions are straddle to the center line and slow at 5 kilometers. So generally that's what's going to reduce the risk, is really slowing down. So basically going, yep, you can go over the structure, however, I want 10 kilometers an hour, and I want you to straddle to the center line. Depending on the structure, you may want them to go to the left-hand lane or the right-hand lane, depending on, I guess, your structural reports on that particular structure. There are other conditions where you only want that particular vehicle to be the only vehicle on the structure, and therefore you would want them to impose, for example, like a pilot or police condition to say only the vehicle is allowed on, only that vehicle is allowed on the structure, or one vehicle at a time on the structure. And then you can go police required or pilot required to stop traffic, incoming traffic. So there's different types of conditions, and it's all about basically reducing that risk. These particular conditions, when you send them through to us, will be reviewed. So we'll make sure that under HVNL that they're appropriate. But generally they're the standard conditions that you would write in that section. More than happy, if you're a bit confused about what to write in this, to give me a call, and I'll let you know if it's a condition that can be imposed. But what we'll do for the time being is we'll just leave it as straddle to the center line and slow to 5 kilometers. So we would then add that condition, and if we scroll down here, added conditions. So this is where what I was mentioning beforehand, where you can actually view the standard conditions set out by the regulator. So this will show you that the regulator has already given these conditions. So for example, if you weren't going to add any more pilot and escorts, you could go, yep, that's cool. No matter what happens, this particular vehicle will have to abide by the minimum escort requirements as part of the multi-state notice. And if you wanted to see what the standard conditions are on the multi-state notice, you just review that notice and see what standard conditions are there. But there's those standard conditions that you can see for yourself. But if, for example, this particular vehicle wanted to, you wanted to impose a pilot and escort requirement, you would go in here and you would type in pilot. I would go just as a standard to give you an idea. And what I potentially can do, I'll talk to Todd after this. Potentially I can give you some pretty standard conditions that you can utilize. If you want a pilot and escort condition, you type in PE. You then scroll down to PE. And this would give you some standard pilot and escort conditions. So if you were to click on this one, P01, pilot and escort requirements standard, you would go add. Please make sure that when you get to this point, again, like the bridge condition, it's a variable condition. So you're able to actually indicate what type of pilots you can allow. So if you wanted to have two pilots, you could indicate 2. This is really important, the pilot type. Because the different pilots and police and escorts are different costs for a customer. So if it's a standard pilot, it obviously costs a lot less than a certified pilot. But if you required a certified pilot to do the movement, then you could indicate that otherwise. So for example, we'll just use 1 pilot. And in this instance, we might go escort vehicle. We might need 1 police to follow them as they go along. Generally speaking, these pilot conditions are imposed by the state jurisdiction. They generally will put in place what they need for the particular customer to travel by. Obviously, if they're traveling on a state road for the majority of time, they're going to have that particular pilot and escort along with them. However, if you are not happy with what the jurisdiction's willing to offer, then you can obviously offer something a bit higher. But if you're happy with what they offer, or if you're happy with the minimum, then no need to apply a pilot and escort requirement. The other ones that can be imposed is wet weather. So you can look that up by just searching weather. So this one here, RI01. So basically, this is a really good standard one that's utilized all the time, that runs through on unsealed roads in single lane narrow roads, travel suspended for periods of prolonged rain up to 1 day for every 5 millimeters of rain. So that's a pretty standard one. If you did want to edit that, however, you can definitely edit. I'm not sure why that's. You can definitely edit that. So if you are happy with them to change that to 2 days, however, you want 10 mils, if it's after 10 millimeters, you can definitely edit that. So this particular condition will always, these variable conditions will always prompt you. They won't automatically pre-fill. They'll always prompt you to write stuff in. So if you don't write anything in there, it will just be standard. It will just, if you were just to say, okay, that would be the standard condition that it would impose. So that's about it for just standard conditions. But yeah, the best way to search that is through the search bar with specific, I guess, keywords. Or the other one, and what I'll try and do after this is provide you with some pretty standard conditions for standard situations, so that you can just go straight to them. The next one is, if you look through this particular standard condition set and you can't find anything in here that would reduce the risk, you can always add a custom condition. So custom conditions, you would then give, basically give it a group. So either it's a road or travel condition. So for example, we'll do it as a travel condition code. So this is where this will be up to you as a road manager to manage your condition codes. So if you have a system that you want to put in place on how you want your conditions written, then you can go about that way. We're not going to stipulate what codes you utilize. That's up to you. But let's say if we go travel conditions and we want to go, and I'm just going to use this as an example, but this is already a standard condition. But if you go speed, so you go TS for travel speed, and you go 0, 1, you go, I might just go restricted speed. Then you can write in your code. So the heavy vehicle is to 60 kilometers on the route. Less a So that's something that you could type in. So this one here is a standard condition, which you could search. However, but if you couldn't find something like that, you would put that in. So the risk mitigated is to do with, and this is up to you to show what the risk mitigated, but I would generally say that's a public safety. You want to make sure that they're traveling at a reasonable speed. Reason for the condition, I generally say I would copy this over to say that's the reason, it's due to public safety. And then you can add it to a condition set. So you have to add it to a condition set to actually save it. So in this case, what we would do is we would just put it in the class 1. You'll have standard condition sets, and I'll show you how to utilize those as well. And then you go add. Perfect. And you'll see that that's been added as a condition. I think what hasn't added. I'll have a look. It might have added it. So after all this, once you're happy with your conditions you're imposed, you would go down to the bottom here and you would go submit request and say yes. It will then turn light blue and it will say regulator reviewing request. The regulator will then get a notification to say that, that the road manager has sent through their request. So the custom condition hasn't come through. I'll see why that hasn't come through later on, and I'll look into that. But if a custom condition comes through, what ends up happening is that particular condition comes through and it comes through as grey, and then we get a notification to accept it or reject it. If we reject it, please don't take it personally. We just basically, it doesn't comply with the HVNL, or we need additional information, and we'll basically either give you a call or respond in this area here. So we would go request rejected, and we basically explain why that particular custom condition needs to be updated. But if we're happy with the custom condition, we'll accept it, and no further correspondence will be needed between the regulator and the road manager. But what happens is we would then review that. We would go, yep, we're happy with that. We're happy with this. We're happy with all of that. And then we would accept it. So we would then go by complete, and then that would basically stop our review and your review of the application. But if I go back into this section here, just go into decisions. So I'll just withdraw that for the time being. That's a function that you also have. So if you were to put in conditions and then go, oh, I forgot to put this condition, you can always withdraw it and then start again. So if you wanted to add conditions, if you said, okay, this is a standard route, I've seen this route multiple times, or this particular vehicle, prime mover and platform trailer with 10 axles, we are happy for anything up to this to have these conditions. And you're going, well, I've got 10 conditions that I want to impose all at once. There's an easy way to do that that you can do, where you go approval with conditions, you go add conditions, and then you can see this side here, which is condition set. So if you want to add it separately, you would go add conditions and then add custom conditions if you wanted to go through the separate conditions. Otherwise, you can go into condition set. If you've got a class 1 condition and go, I am happy with all of those conditions on there, I will add all conditions. And that literally adds every single one of those conditions. So the way that you build out your condition sets, you would go into your condition management. So this is on this left-hand side under your road manager section. You would go to condition management and condition libraries. That takes you here. That gives you a list of your current condition sets. If you wanted to create a new one, so we're going to go to condition example, you just hit new and you go okay. That then at the bottom will give you this one here, condition example. That particular condition set has nothing in it right now. There's no conditions in there, and you would need to add the conditions yourself. So if you go add conditions and you wanted to go, I want RI08 to do with damage, you would go add to set, and then you would go add to condition set, and you would scroll down to the bottom and go condition example. You'd go, yep, I want that particular standard condition in my condition set for these particular vehicles. You would go okay, and then that would add that to that condition set. If you wanted to add RI01 for your wet weather, you would go add to set. Again, you would go in here and go down to condition example. You go okay. If you wanted to impose a condition where they needed to report damage, you would go add to set. You go insert name, John, department name, NHVR, contact number. You go add to condition set, and that would save all of those details as well. So any variable condition that you do add to a condition set will save those details for you. And then you go okay. Then we would go into our condition sets, and then we would click on our condition example. You can see that RI01, RI08, and RI10 are all in there. So then when you go to actually do an application, if you go, I'm happy with this particular vehicle envelope, as long as I impose these conditions, you can go into that condition set, click add all conditions, and then you're done. So that's how you do use your condition sets. And again, you could use that with your bridge conditions, your pilot conditions, pretty much any condition in here. You'll also be able to do it with custom conditions. So once a custom condition becomes a standard condition, it will come into your library and you'll be able to add that to your condition set as well. So in the first instance, when you're creating a condition for the first time, you won't be able to add that to your condition library yet because it needs to be accepted by the regulator. But once it's accepted by the regulator, you can add it to your condition set. Apart from that, that's just a basic overview of how to add conditions, how to utilize how to add custom conditions, and how to create condition sets. So what I might do is I might turn the time over for some questions, if you have any questions, and I'll try and use this particular example to answer your questions.
That's great, Josh. Thank you for that overview. Obviously, there's a lot of territory that you've covered there, but I think it's always good to just review that and cement that understanding. Importantly, from the perspective of these webinars, the webinar series we've been doing, you've covered off on the bridge conditions, which I think is important. We may see over time as we do our assessments, like we're currently doing in the program, that might have actually an impact on some of those conditions within the portal. So we will be reviewing that over time. So for road managers out there and for you guys in Access, we might see some changes to those, which you know would be fairly expected, I suppose, as we understand that a bit better and we craft some of those conditions for certain circumstances. So watch that space. But yeah, thanks, Josh. That was really good. I think we've got a couple of questions here in the chat. I'm just going to go back to the top. So we have got Robert Bruce Duncan. G'day, Robert. Thanks for joining us again. Can you cover the enforcement of the road manager's conditions? Josh, can you make any comments around enforcement?
So correct me if I'm wrong. Sorry, it was Robert?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Is this in relation to if you put a condition on the permit and the customer doesn't abide by it, what you are able to do as a road manager? Is that what your question is, Robert?
You there, Robert?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah.
So obviously, this question has come about. I've had a few road managers ask this question beforehand. They've gone, look, I put this condition on here to say report damage and no one ever reports damage. and I know who's doing it. So obviously we do have, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but we do have a report line for you to report those instances to. The other thing is if you give a permit to a particular company or a particular movement, you give it for the first time and they cause damage, that gives you the opportunity to issue refusals going through that road. So obviously I understand you want to obviously give people as much access as they can, but if that particular access is always going to cause damage or they're going to speed through, and you do feel it's going to risk the public safety or the infrastructure, you're more than welcome to refuse that. So I will pass on to Todd those details for you to contact if you are getting people that aren't abiding by it. And then obviously we can get a team in there to kind of look into, and if they need to be booked, they can be booked.
Thanks, Josh. Also from Robert, are the QR at level railway crossings considered as a road manager or other authority?
Other authority. Yep, so QR is another authority that they need to contact to see whether or not they can cross that particular structure.
Also from Robert, we're on a roll here. Some house relocation conditions for the applicant to building approvals and bonds paid before moving the house onto a block of land or moving a house from a block of land.
Yep, so this particular condition, so unfortunately we can't impose conditions that are council conditions. So if you have a requirement that they have to pay a bond, that's got nothing to do with travel. I understand from your perspective, you don't want to give approval until they've paid that bond. If you want to, you can obviously put in a condition that says that prior to movement, you must contact council and give an email address and a number. That's the best way to give an approval. Yeah, unfortunately with bonds or other requirements by council, we can't impose that on our permits because it's got, all you're doing is you're giving them access to the road. It's not to do with how they put the house on the road.
I got another one here from Claude. Has the HVNL now included refusal for accessing a site that is illegal, has no planning permit? Oh yeah, this one's certainly come up before.
Yeah,
so again, I think we're crossing over into that territories of other laws and legislation, really. Correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, but I don't believe the HVNL actually covers that at this point in time.
I don't believe it covers it. I can have a look into it, Todd, to see whether or not we have anything. But yeah, again, like you said, Todd, it's to do with other legislations and other laws outside of the HVNL.
Yeah, and as you say, you can't really hold up or refuse a permit on the basis of that other condition that might be covered under another law. So yeah, that's my understanding, Claude, and I haven't looked at the law myself for a while, but it's not covered. I know it's been raised plenty of times. I think you and I have had a conversation about this over the years. But there has been a HVNL review. I'm not sure whether that's something that's come up that's going to be a subject of change to the Act. I couldn't tell you the detail of what's in there, but I guess our understanding is that that's not the case. It's still dealt with separately. All right, so that looks like all the questions so far. So we might just wrap up. Josh, if you can just reshare the presentation. I think we've got one or two slides to cover, or I think we've got a late question here from Anthony. Part of a development application is a speed limit on a road for heavy vehicles. Is this DA condition, which is about amenity, a valid reason as a public submission?
So as part of a DA, so they've got the DA approval. And so are you talking about the speed that in which the vehicle, sorry, I don't know if I've quite understood the question.
He's talking about speed, specifically mentioning speed limit on a road. Part of a development application is a speed limit on a road for heavy vehicles. Is this DA condition a valid reason as a public submission?
Yes, it is. So the way that you would do that is you wouldn't reference the DA. because the DA is to do with the development approval of that particular building. And you can't reference that particular document. You would just basically get the details out of that document and say, the DA requires you to travel at 40 kilometres an hour. Therefore, you would put a standard condition of when travelling on the approved route, the operator must travel at 40 kilometres an hour or less. In our standard condition, we reference the signposted speed limit as well. So if you were to say, oh, I only want them to travel at 60 kilometres an hour, but along your route, you've got different roads that drop to 50 or 40. There's a catch-all kind of that if you go, oh, I can only travel at 60, they need to abide by those signposted. We keep that in there as just an FYI. At the end of the day, that is the law. So just because a permit says you can travel at 60 kilometres an hour doesn't exempt you from any signposted limits, but we just do it as an FYI.
Excuse me. Robert's just added to his question about QR, Queensland Rail. Question for QR was about the overhead clearance to lines for electric trains. So
Yeah,
again, they would cover that under their conditions or what have you as part of the process.
Yeah, so that would be more of a custom condition, Robert. So if you wanted to be very specific, so you could basically say, and that's part of your assessment. So if you're reviewing the assessment and you see that there's overhead lines and they're at 4.8 meters and the vehicle's at 5, you can either go, well, this isn't even going to get through, or you can obviously apply the condition that they wouldn't be required to get third parties. So a lot of these ones where they're third parties for lines, they can utilize skid rails as well, so they can basically pop the lines up. So even though they're down at 4.8 and they're at 5 meters high, they do have that capacity, and that would be a condition of the third party. But if you obviously, because you don't own that asset, but you're comfortable with them traveling on the roads, however you know that they have to consult with QR, I would do that as a custom condition. If you want it to be specific, and then you could give a contact details for QR for them to get their third party approval. But that's all part of when they apply for an application, they have to have those third parties in place anyways. But good question.
Thanks, Josh. So that covers off all the questions. If we can just jump back to the final slides.
Yes.
So if we just jump back to that, I think it's just a reminder about the next webinar. We just go down. Was there anything you wanted to say about the guidelines? Just a reminder, really, was it, Josh, on that one?
Yeah, so there's just this e-learn available. So all of these slides are also part of an e-learning presentation. So you can follow the link to that. That gives you guidelines for granting access as well. So if you do have questions that you think can be answered via this particular link, have a look at that. But if not, like I said, I'm more than happy to give my number out and let you guys give me a call if you have any questions.
Thanks, Josh.
Maybe what we can do, Linda, are you able to put that in the chat, or would you send that through, Todd?
We can just drop it in the chat there for people. Otherwise, obviously, it's easily available on the NHVR website.
So we've actually got the resources page, and I'd just like to remind everyone I've put the link in the chat where the webinar recordings are housed, and they're also available. All of the resources are also available there, so everything will be there.
Thanks, Linda. All right, we might wrap up. If we just jump back to the final slide, we'll get a look at the next webinar. So we're getting towards the end of this series. So Josh, if I can just get you to reshare that presentation. So we'll be up to, just keep going. Yeah, here we go. Thanks, Josh. So the next webinar this Thursday on the 29th So this will be looking at the functionality that we've built into the portal, what we've called the digital asset management. So how we're now storing asset details and reports and other documents that might refer to assessments that have been done, and also the functionality built to allow you to actually provide that data, which, as I talked about in a previous webinar, having that data there is going to be really important in terms of driving some efficiencies around rapid assessment and some of those other functions that we're currently building. So that's the next webinar. If you haven't already registered, jump on and do so. Yeah, hopefully we'll see you there. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks to Josh for covering off on the condition side of things. That was very thorough. Hopefully people got a lot out of that, and also answered those questions, which was great. So thanks, Josh. Thanks, everyone, and look forward to seeing you in the next webinar on the digital asset management. Thanks, everyone. Bye for today.